Hi everybody, it's Ryan here, and today we're going to be looking at fiscal policy. So what is fiscal policy? It's actually very simple. All that it refers to is government taxation and government spending.
So as you can see, the definition is that simple. Fiscal policy refers to government decisions on taxing and government spending.
Here you can see what the UK government spends its money on.
And as you can see, the biggest areas here are social protection, which is to say welfare policies and direct transfers. Health, when you think of health, you think of NHS at £178 billion, education at £116 billion, and then it sort of goes down from there. Things like defense at $55 billion, transport at $44 billion, $36 billion on personal social services. One thing that I want you to have a look at is this idea of debt interest at $56 billion, and we'll talk about that a bit later as well.
And here you can see the ways that the government gets its tax revenue.
The biggest one being income tax at $208 billion, and then you look through and you see, well, VAT or value added tax at $161 billion, national insurance contributions, which is a payroll tax at $150 billion, and then other smaller taxes being corporation tax at $58 billion, excise duties at $48 billion, council tax $38 billion.
A couple of terms that you'll often see associated with fiscal policy are things like the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who is the senior government minister who is in charge of setting the government budget and tax policy, currently Rishi Sunak.
Here we've got a picture of Rishi Sunak doing that famous pose where he holds out the red briefcase in front of number 11 Downing Street, which is his official office and residence. I would definitely recommend having a look at the most recent budget, the one from March 2020. It's an absolutely big one, and there's lots of really interesting information about fiscal policies in there. Another term you'll often hear about in relation to fiscal policy is austerity, which describes the policies which aim to reduce public sector spending. Typically, this is really associated with David Cameron's coalition government of 2010, which made deep cuts to public spending in order to try to drive down the public sector debt.
So we'll be looking at this question, does the government spend more than it receives? And typically the answer will be yes, it does.
So the first thing is this idea of government budget balance. Is it positive, which means that the government is collecting more money than it spends, or is it negative, which means that it's spending more money than it collects? And as you can see over the trend of time, it doesn't really matter which political party is in power. Usually the government is going to be running a budget deficit. Sometimes there's a budget surplus, but as you can see here, a budget deficit in the early 90s, which became a surplus by the late 90s or the 2000s. Typically a bit of a budget deficit through the 2000 noughties, and then a very, very big budget deficit, which happened in 2008 because of all the big public spending that was associated with trying to drag the UK economy out of the Great Recession.
A couple of terms that you'll see when we refer to what the budget looks like
is if you say a budget surplus, it means that the government receives more in tax revenue than it spends. A budget deficit, which means the government spending is higher than what it receives in tax revenue. And a balanced budget, where the government spending is equal to government tax revenue.
So let's take a little look at how the government will fund its budget deficit.
If the government spends more than it receives in revenue, it can borrow the difference. It does this by selling government bonds. These are also known as gilts. I want you to think about this in very simple terms, which is to say that the government goes to financial markets and says, can you please give me an IOU? If you give me £100 today, I will pay you back £100 plus £3 tomorrow, paying back the original plus a little bit of interest. Anybody can buy these bonds. They mostly get sold to pension funds and professional investors. Here's an illustration of how the government will fund its budget deficit. The UK government, if they're running a budget deficit, says, I need money. So the bond market, made up of professional investors and people who have a lot of money, say, great. We've got money, we'll be happy to give it to you, or that is to say, lend it to you. So the government issues these gilts or bonds. They used to actually be on pieces of paper. And what the gilt does is it sets out legal terms to say in the next 10 years, I will pay you, the bondholder, £1 per year, and then at the end of the 10-year period, I will give you your original £100 back. So the bond markets say, that sounds good. Here's £100, you give me the bond, and over the course of time, the government will be paying me money. The bond market likes this because it's a fairly safe investment. The UK government does not default on its debts. They always pay back whatever has been lent to it. And it's also good for the UK government because the more money they want to get, all they have to do is issue more bonds. And it allows them to run a budget deficit. One thing that's very important to understand is the relationship and the difference between a budget deficit and the national debt. So when the government runs a budget deficit, it means that they're spending more than they collect in revenue. They need to fund this through selling bonds, and as they sell bonds, the national debt grows, all else being equal. When the government runs a budget surplus, they can pay down the national debt, and so therefore the national debt will fall, all else being equal. Now, to make sure that you understand the difference, the government budget deficit is the difference between annual takings and what they're spending. And so typically if you see a budget deficit, this is going to be sort of in the billions of pounds. So in 2017, it was 39.7 billion or 2.3% of GDP. Now the national debt in 2017 of the same year was 2.1 trillion pounds or 85% of GDP. So when you see figures about the national debt, it's not to do with how much money is there difference in any one year. The national debt is the accumulation of all the deficits that have ever been run by this government and all previous governments. What logically follows between this relationship is that typically when a government is running a surplus, they're able to pay down the national debt. And so that, as you can see here, a surplus that was taking place in the late 1980s meant that the national debt was able to be paid down. When the government's running a deficit, as they were in the mid-90s, the national debt will tend to rise. Have a surplus, you see the national debt falling. Run a deficit, and especially the big deficits that we saw in the late 2000s, 2008, 2009, you will see the national debt increase. Now, the really interesting thing about this, and the thing you want to take note of, is the context. Is that in the UK, typically we would have national debt as about 40% of GDP. Remember that this axis over here represents a percentage of GDP that the public sector debt is running at. In 2008, this figure jumped from just under 40% to now about 80%, and it has remained there ever since. And that's the context that you want to think about when you think about how much is our national debt. Now, it will be very interesting. At the time of making this video in April 2020, we have not yet seen the increase that is going to be happening because of the 2020 budget and the coronavirus crisis, but we'd expect this to be rising quite a bit. That is to say, the national debt to be rising quite a bit after this. Another thing you can look at if you'd like to is the national debt clock, which, as says here, stands at 2.3 trillion pounds and increases by 5,000 pounds per second. Now, you can often find a lot of these sorts of national debt clocks around. Take note, however, that when you talk about the national debt, public sector debt, who is this money owed to? Well, it's not owed to any particular individual. It's owed to all the people who have ever bought government bonds. And those people are people like you and me. And if you've got relatives who are on a pension, then the pension fund has bought that debt as a secure investment. And so whoever is receiving that pension is a part owner of the national debt. So don't think of it as necessarily such a bad thing, because that debt is owed to everybody. It's owed to anybody who's ever bought a government bond.
Here are a couple of other recommended videos to watch to help further understand this topic.
Here's a cool video from the BBC, which explains a little bit about government taxation. And this video here has a very good explanation of how it is that the government sells bonds.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and good luck with the rest of your revision on this topic.